Have you ever wanted to be a career criminal that got away with it only because you were part of the law at the same time? Well, that's who we're going to go over today. We're going to go over the notorious Jim Miller, who is also known as Jim Killer Miller. Welcome, angry faithful. Yes, today we're going to go over Jim Miller. Before that, I actually tried to record it again and I had to redo the whole thing. But I talked to a Lindsay Hughes, Permanent Jewelry. If you go to Facebook, it's Glitzy Links or Lindsay K108 at gmail.com. I'm not going to put her phone number. I'll put her email address in the link below. But let's check out her stuff real quick. It's nice little stuff that she does. The email doesn't work on the Facebook page, so just message her or whatnot. It is nice little jewelry. Here we go. And let us begin. Okay. Now, on October 25th, 1861, which some sources say is October 24th, 1866, which we'll just go to 61 because a lot of the stuff on here is timeline. It messes everything up. But Miller was born in Van Buren, Arkansas, to Jacob and Cynthia Miller. When he was 1 year old, him and his family moved to Texas in 1862. Jim's father, Jacob, was a stonemason who helped build the first Capitol building in Austin. However, somewhere along the lines, Jacob died, and his mother was listed as widow in census reports. When the boy was 8, some accounts said that he killed his grandparents. However, that was actually proven to be true. At eight, he killed his parents. 8. Okay. Anyways, by 1880, he was documented as living with his widowed mother and siblings in Cornell County. 4 years later, his sister Georgia married John Cope, a man Jim Miller detested. On July 30th, 1884, John Cope was murdered by a shotgun blast in his bed at his home 8 miles northwest of Gatesville, Texas, in Cornell County. It was known that Jim disliked his brother-in-law, and he soon was arrested for the murder. He was tried and convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. But, however, Slippery Miller, his attorney took the case to Texas Court of Appeals, where the conviction was reversed on a technicality. It doesn't show on any of the documentation what the technicality was, but there we go. Now, afterwards, Miller started an outlaw gang in Sansoba County, Texas, robbing trains, stagecoaches, and often killing in the process. He was also purchased 1/2 interest of the saloon in Sansoba. At that time, he was marked as a career as an assassin and casually proclaimed that he was murdered anyone for money. Counts of his price was $150 to $2,000, which it's about $5,000 to about $75,000. In his newfound career, he eventually earned a reputation of getting the job done quickly and efficiently, usually using a shotgun to ambush at night. In appearance, Miller was a mild-mannered man, never cursed, didn't drink, smoke, and was very well dressed, wearing a white shirt with a stiff collar, which back then it was kind of expensive, a stick pin in his lapel, a diamond ring, and also wearing, which will come into effect later on, a heavy flock coat. Well, basically, it's a thick coat, regardless of how hot it may be. And by the way, it gets up to 120 degrees in Texas. So wearing that kind of coat all the time, wow. Despite his occupation, he was also known to attend church and read the Bible. He was not so a fast draw gunfighter like many others of the West, but was quickly to use a gun when it suited him. In addition to killing for hire, he was also known to have killed several men in a saloon when arguments erupted over poker games, which happened a lot back then, that time frame. In about 1882, Miller was arrested and disarmed by young Sansoba Deputy Sheriff D. Harkley, later one of the most famous lawmen of the West. Shortly after, Miller drifted into McCulloch County, where he raced horses and worked as a cowboy for the M. Manning Clements Sr., a violent man who was the older cousin of John Wesley Hardin. While there, Miller became good friends with Emil's son, Emil Manning Clements Jr., and Manning's daughter, Sally. Jim and Sally married in McCulloch County on February 15th, 1888, and would eventually have 4 children. Miller's next drift through southeast New Mexico and West Texas, along the Mexican border. Sorry. Little is known as his activities during these years, but he was also later to brag, "I lost my notchstick on Mexicans that I killed out on the border." Basically, a notchstick is a calculator. Basically, how many things you've done in a certain situation. This being killing, and a lot of those notches ended up on guns. Some of the guns from back on that time frame, they would take their knife and they would notch the gun of how many like deers they've killed with that gun or how many people they killed. By 1891, Miller was in Pisco, Texas, where Reeves County Sheriff George A. Bud Fraser, and yes, it's Fraser, not Frazier, Fraser, Frazer, soon hired him. The 27-year-old Fraser, who had been sheriff for less than a year, was badly in need of a deputy in the frontier town and asked a few questions of Miller. In those days, asking too many questions about one's past was considered rude. He should have asked more questions. But this would be a false mistake of Fraser. Miller had moved his family along with his brother-in-law, Manny Clements, to Pisco, where his family attended church and was upstanding group by all appearances. At about the same time frame, cattle rustling and horse theft increased up and down the Pisco Valley. Miller spent most of his time pursuing the thieves, but when he never captured any, it raised suspicions in the mind of the local gunfighter and hard case, Barney Riggs, who just happened to be Bud Fraser's brother-in-law. As the increase in theft had started to occur at about the same time as Miller's became a deputy, Riggs pointed out that perhaps Miller should be considered a suspect and suggested that Miller be fired. When Fraser confronted his deputy, Miller laughed off the accusation. Miller, supported by members of his church and with no proof of allegations, was kept on by Fraser and continued to serve as deputy. However, when Miller killed a Mexican prisoner who had tried to escape, quotation marks, he tried to escape, Fraser investigated. Barney Riggs alleged that Miller had murdered the man because he knew that the deputy had hidden a pair of stolen mules. When Fraser found that Riggs was correct and located the stolen mules, he immediately fired Miller. This is what began the deadly Fraser Miller feud, which would last for several years. And on those accounts, in 1892 Pisco sheriff's election, Jim Miller opposed Bud Fraser but lost. However, this did not stop Miller from getting appointed as Pisco's city marshal. It's so funny that you would be. Anyways, I digress. It really is funny, and it's like, well, I'm just gonna do this other job and mess up your entire job. Marshal Jim Miller was hired his brother-in-law Manny Clements as his deputy. He surrounded himself with gunmen, including a hard case gunfighter named Bill Earhart, John Denson, and other cousins of John Wesley Hardin. Martin Q. Hardin, who is known to have been related to John Wesley, but the two referred them to themselves as cousins. In May 1893, Sheriff Fraser was away on business, and Miller's criminal element virtually took over the town. God, I wish I could take over a town. I mean, I'm not evil, but I kind of want to take over a town. It was so easy back then. In the meantime, Miller and his henchmen were also hatching a plan to assassinate him upon his return. When the sheriff returned, the plan was stage a shootout on a railroad station platform. Nearby, there would be a third man who would shoot Fraser, making it appear that the stray bullet had killed him. However, when Con Gibbs overheard the plan while in the local saloon, he contacted Fraser and let him know about it. Fraser, in turn, contacted the Texas Rangers. And when Fraser arrived, he was flanked by Texas Rangers. Captain John R. Hughes, who soon arrested Miller, Clements, and Martin Hardin. The three were indicted on indicted on September 7th, 1893, for conspiring to kill Fraser. The case was transferred to El Paso to be tried. However, Con Gibbs, the primary prosecuting witness, fled to Newberry Eddy, now Carlsbad, New Mexico, where Miller's henchmen shot and killed John Denson. With their witness gone, who's John Denson? Okay, Miller henchman John Denson shot and killed Con Gibbs. God, it took me a while to figure that out. I read through this like 3 times, and that part kind of confused me. John Denson wasn't killed. Con Gibbs was killed by John Denson. Writing on this article is really messed up. Anyways, but the state was forced to release the 3 prisoners. Though Miller had once more escaped from the long arm of the law, he was loose. He did lose his job as marshal, weird, and bought a hotel in Bisco. Miller then appeared to be living the life of an honest citizen, and the town settled down. However, word began to spread that Fraser couldn't handle Miller and had no business being sheriff. The talk naturally built up resentments into the young sheriff. On August 18th, 1894, when Bud Fraser encountered Miller on the street, he yelled at him, "Jim, you're a cattle rustler and a murderer. Here's one for Con Gibbs." Fraser then opened fire on Miller, striking him in the right arm near the shoulder. Miller fired back but succeeded in only grazing a man named Joe Crackus, a local shopkeeper. Fraser then emptied his pistol into Miller's chest, and he collapsed. Bud then walked away, only to find out that Miller wasn't dead. I mean, if you fire one shot in the arm, so it's 6 revolvers, unless he had a cowboy load, which the cowboy load is just an empty chamber, he probably shot him 4 times in the chest. Several of his friends picked up Miller and carried him to the hotel. Also surprised that the man wasn't dead either. They discovered a metal breastplate in Miller's under his coat. Basically, he figured out a cheat code with body armor. Now it became clear why the hired killer always wore a heavy flocked coat. However, that information was not to be shared with Fraser. Though Miller survived, he would spend the next several months hold on real quick. Recovering. He's several months recovering from health. And there was no more conflicts between the 2 men, though Miller had been making threats the entire time. I guess they didn't do it in public. In November 1894, when the sheriff election came up, Fraser lost. He then moved to Carlsbad, New Mexico, where he opened up a livery stable, basically a horse stable. Fraser returned to Pesco. I guess livery stable would be more or less a parking lot nowadays. Fraser returned to Pisco the next month to settle his affairs. The ex-sheriff encountered Jim Miller in front of Zimmer's blacksmithing shop on December 26, 1894. Having heard the frequent threats Miller had made against him, Fraser drew his gun, sending 2 shots into the right arm and the left leg. Jim began firing left-handed without success, while Fraser sent 2 more slugs in Miller's chest. Amazingly, again, Miller was still alive and standing. This confused as he fled. Only later would the sheriff find out about Miller's protected breastplate. Now, in March 1895, John Wesley Hardin, who had become an attorney while in prison, arrived in Pisco and filed charges against the murder against Fraser trying to kill Miller. The ex-sheriff trial was scheduled to be heard in El Paso. However, Hardin was killed before it came to trial, and Fraser was acquitted in May 1896. Miller, of course, was furious and in the end would take his final revenge. Bud Fraser was not Miller's only target. Barney Riggs, Bud's brother-in-law, the hard case gunfighter and the man who has exposed Miller's thievery while he was a deputy, was also in Jim's crosshairs. Riggs is also said to have the only man killer Jim Miller. God, sometimes these words together, they're really tongue twisters. Anyways, Jim Miller, Bud was the only Jim Miller was the only person Bud ever truly feared. In typical fashion, Miller decided that Riggs should also die. In the early 1896, two of Miller's henchmen, John Denson and that was John Hardin. Too many Johns in this. John Denson and Bill Earhart were overheard in Fort Stockton, Texas, murmuring threats against Barney Riggs. Later, the pair left for Pesco, Texas, to seek out Miller's nemesis. However, a U.S. Deputy Marshal D. Hartley, wired a warning telegram to Riggs. When the pair arrived, Barney avoided them. However, on the morning of March 3rd, he was also alone as Riggs was substituting for a friend as a bartender in R.S. Johnson's saloon. Denson and Earhart burst into the room. A shot from Earhart's grazed Barney, who instantly fired back, killing the other man. He then grappled with Denson before the would-be assassin was able to flee. Riggs followed, and as Denson was running down the street, Riggs shot him in the back of his head, killing him on the spot. Miller's scheme to eliminate the one man he feared had failed. After the shooting, Riggs surrendered himself and was later tried for murder and acquitted. Later that year, even though Bud Fraser knew that Miller was out to get him, he made a mistake of visiting his family in nearby Toja, Texas, in September 1896. On the morning of the 14th, Bud played cards with friends in a saloon when Miller pushed open the door and fired both barrels, practically blowing Fraser's head from his body. When Bud's distraught sister approached Miller with a gun, he said to her, "I'll give you what your brother got. I'll shoot you right in the face." Once again, the far too lucky and evil Jim Miller's accusation of the murder of Fraser. His defense began that he had done no worse than Fraser, basically saying that Fraser was out to get him too. And that is the hardcore. He's like, dude, he was gonna kill me too. I just did it first. I mean, come on. If that's a defense, that's a defense, in my opinion. During the trial, a man named Joe Earp, no relations to the Earp brothers, who had testified in his trial, became his next target. Several weeks afterwards, Joe Earp was shot down reportedly by Miller himself before galloping 100 miles in one night to establish an alibi. Next, Miller made his way to Memphis in Texas Panhandle. There, he ran a saloon where he openly blasted his many murders. He was also said to have worked as part-time deputy sheriff again. In August 1898, he was allegedly made a Texas Ranger for a brief time, but there's no accurate of this occurring. But it is also believed that he was just masquerading as a Texas Ranger. In 1899, an attorney named Stanley prosecuted Miller on the charge of subordination of perjury, basically meaning persuading another to commit perjury. This charge was related to Joe Earp's account during Miller's murder trial of Bud Fraser. Mysteriously, attorney Stanley soon after died of food poisoning, which history tells is more likely Miller's work. Miller then returned to Pisco area where he spent time in Monahans. Sorry. However, in 1900s, he and his wife Stanley started to live in Fort Worth, where the assassin became involved in real estate and did very well financially. Even so, killing appeared to be in his blood, and his financial situation had little impact on his choice to continue his career as a killer. At this time, the Great Sheep War, which I really, really want to go over. I'm probably going to do that next week. The Great Sheep War. It's almost as good as the Great Llama. Great. Anyways, there's the big ostrich war in Australia. It's really funny. But anyways, the Great Sheep Wars were taking place with the cattlemen, and Miller quickly was hired out to kill the sheepmen for just $150 per job, killing as many as dozen men. At the same time, numerous feuds regarding fences. Basically, farmers were putting up fences so cattle couldn't go in and graze their land, which got in the way of great cattle herds. And Miller was more than happy to help the cattlemen by killing the farmers who fenced their land. In 1904, Miller ambushed and killed Lubbock lawyer James Jarrett, who had successfully represented several farmers against the big cattle interest. He received $500 for ambushing their attorney. That same year, he would also kill a man he did real estate business within Fort Worth, D.T. Frank Four, who was an honest businessman who threatened to tell a grand jury that Miller was selling lots of land submerged in the Gulf of Mexico. On March 10th, 1904, Miller cornered Ford in a washroom in Delaware hotel and shot him dead. People rushed to see what had happened, and Miller fled over Ford's body, tears in his eye, exclaiming, "I did everything I could to keep him from reaching for his gun." Amazingly, Miller was acquitted again. God, back then you could kill dozens of people and get away with it if you had the right notions. Continuing his wicked ways, Miller took a job in Indian Territory in 1906 in a small town of Ora, Oklahoma, in Chickasaw Nation. There lived a U.S. Deputy Marshal, Ben Collins, who has served he also served as Indian policeman, which there's a big difference in an actual policeman in regular United States and Indian Territory. And look it up. It's pretty interesting. Several years later, Ben Collins had tried to arrest a man named Port Pruitt. Now, there's going to be a tongue twister in here. So, a prominent citizen in Emmett, Oklahoma, resisting arrest, Collins shot him, leaving Pruitt partially paralyzed. That's the tongue twister. Partially paralyzed. Pruitt partially paralyzed. Port and his brother publicly swore vengeance on Ben Collins, who then hired Miller for $1,800 to take care of their enemy. On August 1st, 1906, as Collins was riding home from to his farm, he reluctantly received a load of buckshot which knocked him from his horse. However, the young longman got off 4 rounds while on the ground. Another shotgun blast tore his face off. An intense investigation soon began, pointing that Miller and another man named Washmood once again arrested. Miller spent a short time in jail, but was released on bail before Miller could be tried. Any witnesses were soon killed. And once again, the prosecution died from a lack of evidence, witnesses, and evidence. Next, Miller was accused of killing Pat Garrett on February 28th, 1908. Garrett was allegedly killed because of a land dispute, and by some accounts, Miller murdered a paid assassin. However, it was unlikely that Wayne Brazel confessed to the crime later. Carl Adamson, who was married to cousin Sally Miller, was also with Garrett when he was killed. This led to rumors that Miller was involved. However, most historians agreed that Garrett's murder happened without the killer's involvement. On December 29th, 1908, Emil Manny Clements Jr., Miller's longtime friend and cohort, was killed in a saloon fight in El Paso, Texas. Miller swore revenge and no doubt would have followed through, except he had offered of $1,700 to kill former U.S. Marshal Allen Augustus Gus Bobbitt in Ada, Oklahoma. At this time, the flourishing town of Ada was thriving cotton center, but also had a violent reputation. In 1908, some 36 people were murdered. Bobbitt had retired from U.S. Deputy Marshal's position after Oklahoma became a state's previous years, moving to a ranch in Rolfe, Oklahoma. However, although retired, Bobbitt was not quiet about his feelings about many of the events in the area. Several citizens, including saloon owner Jesse West and Joe Allen, were practicing what was called Indian skinning. Basically, this practice involved taking advantage of Native Americans who had been granted 160 acres each in exchange for their reservation land. Throughout Oklahoma, law required any such land being sold to whites to have been approved by the county court judge. Several opportunists took advantage of this situation, often getting the Indians drunk and buying their lands, their 160 acres, for as low as $50. Oh, Lord. So they just purchased it for roughly about $2,500. 160 acres. There's so much you could do with 160 acres. Anyways, appalled about what was happening, Gus Bobbitt began publicizing the events and pushing for charges to elected officials in the town and county. As a result, those who were handsomely profiting from hiring the notorious Jim Miller to solve their problem. On February 27th, 1909, Bobbitt was shot as he drove his wagon home from Ada. He lived about an hour away, but before he died, he instructed his wife on how to dispose of his property, which included the $1,000 reward for the man who had killed him, Gus Bobbitt. Within no time, a posse was after Bobbitt's killer and the others, hoping to land the reward. Having long escaped scot-free, as he had many times beforehand, Miller was confident that his escape was sloppy this time. The posse soon found his horse at the home of a man, Williamson, who was said to have been yet another one of Miller's many relatives. Miller borrowed a mare from Williamson, admitting that he had killed a man and threatened to kill Williamson if he talked. In the end, the posse tracked down the notorious killer and found that Bobbitt's paid assassin was indeed Jim Miller, the result of the conspiracy along several individuals. The livestock spectacular named Barry Berlin, who had hired Miller, was not alone. Several others involved in the profitable Indian skinning were also part of the murder. In April, Miller, alongside Jesse West, Joe Allen, and Barry B. Berlin, were arrested for killing of Gus Bobbitt. By April 6, 1909, all of the conspirators were in jail in Ada, Oklahoma. Though it was well known that Miller and the others had killed Bobbitt in a murder for hire scheme, the evidence was not solid. Aware of the lack of evidence and Miller's history of never having suffered the consequences of his actions, caused a lynch mob, which back then that was a thing. Lynch mobs were awesome, especially a person that actually they knew was the bad guy. The lynch mob of about 50 men to storm the jail on April 19th. The mob quickly overpowered the jailers and dragged the 4 men outside in an abandoned horse stable. I have to say horse stable because it's a livery stable, but it was a horse stable behind the jail. The prisoner were bound with baling wire and ropes tossed over the rafters. Miller's cohorts were hanged first, after which the vigilante asked him to admit his crimes. Miller then allegedly responded, "Let the record show that I killed 51 men." Before he died, he also asked for his black brothcloth coat to be draped around his shoulders. And then he said, "Let it rip." Now, that is the end of James Miller. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. And also go to Facebook, go to Glitzy Links, and pick up a couple of stuff for yourself. Only like $20. I mean, I know that the economy's really bad, but sometimes you just gotta pick up something for yourself. Anyways, everybody, thank you for all listening. Thank you for all for watching. Love you guys.